She sat quietly in her first-class seat, headphones in and a book open on her lap, ready for a peaceful flight. But suddenly, a flight attendant stopped beside her and frowned. "Excuse me, miss," she said sharply. "You're in the wrong seat." Confused, the young black girl looked up and responded politely, "No, this is my seat." The attendant didn't bother to check the ticket. Instead, she raised her voice, saying, "People like you don't belong in first class. Please move to the back." The girl's face flushed with embarrassment as passengers nearby began whispering and watching. Humiliated but calm, she stood up without a fight, picked up her bag, and walked toward economy. Quietly, she pulled out her phone and made one short call. "Hi, Daddy. I need your help." What no one knew was that her father was the CEO of the entire airline. Within minutes, the plane paused on the runway. A manager boarded swiftly and walked straight to the flight attendant, who stood frozen. "You're removing me? For her?" she snapped, but the manager didn't argue. In front of the entire cabin, the woman was escorted off the flight. Passengers began clapping. The girl was respectfully guided back to her original seat, now with pride. A new flight attendant apologized and offered her anything she needed. Even the pilot came out to personally say, "Sorry." The girl smiled, calm and composed. It wasn't just about a seat, it was about standing tall in the face of discrimination. That day, everyone on the plane witnessed something powerful. Never underestimate someone's worth based on appearance. Sometimes the quietest ones carry the strongest voices and the highest authority. And justice, it always finds a way to fly first class. She boarded the plane quietly, clutching her book and travel bag, her boarding pass already scanned and tucked neatly in her coat pocket. She wasn't flashy or loud, just a young black girl, dressed neatly in jeans and a sweater, with large, noise-canceling headphones resting around her neck. First-class passengers had already started to settle in, most of them business travelers, older white men and women scrolling through emails or sipping early coffee. She found her seat, 1A, a window seat in the front row. She sat down, politely, nodding to the man beside her, then opened her book. The gentle hum of the plane comforted her, but her peace was suddenly interrupted by a sharp voice. "Excuse me, miss," said a blonde flight attendant with a tight smile and an impatient tone. The girl looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked calmly. "Yes," the woman said with authority. "You're in the wrong seat. This is first class." The girl blinked, confused. "Yes, I know. This is seat 1A. Here's my boarding pass." She reached into her pocket and pulled it out, but the attendant didn't even glance at it. "No," she said firmly. "First class is reserved for priority passengers. You need to move to economy immediately." Heads turned. A few passengers looked up from their laptops and phones. The young girl glanced around, aware of the growing attention, her cheeks growing hot. "I think there's a misunderstanding," she said, still polite, still trying to de-escalate. "I have a first-class ticket. My name is—" "I don't care what your name is," the woman cut her off coldly. "You don't belong here. I'm not going to ask again. Move." The cruelty in her voice wasn't just procedural, it was personal. The words weren't about a seat, they were about skin. A man across the aisle muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." Another woman frowned but said nothing. The girl stood up slowly, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from a bitter mix of humiliation and disappointment. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She could have, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped into the aisle, gathered her bag, and walked down toward the economy section. A tear slid silently down her cheek. The injustice stung, not just because she'd been wrongly accused, but because she knew this wasn't new. She'd seen this before, lived it in classrooms, stores, and now apparently on airplanes. And yet she said nothing. She simply sat down in an empty row in economy, pulled out her phone, and dialed one number. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly. I'm on the flight. But something happened. Her voice trembled as she explained what had just occurred. On the other end of the line, silence. Then, "What's the name of the flight? Gate number? Flight attendant's name?" She gave all the details. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll take care of it." What most people didn't know, what the flight attendant certainly didn't bother to find out, was that her father wasn't just her dad. He was the CEO of the airline, the man whose name was on every internal policy, every press release, every training manual. And within minutes, things began to shift. The captain was contacted mid-prep. A red alert came through from airline headquarters. Ground staff scrambled to respond. The flight, which had just begun taxiing, paused unexpectedly. A supervisor in a navy blue blazer and clipboard rushed toward the plane, speaking through the jet bridge intercom. Within moments, the flight attendant was summoned to the front. She looked annoyed, inconvenienced, as if she were being taken away from important duties. The supervisor didn't raise his voice, but his words hit hard. "You're being removed from this flight for violating company policy and racial discrimination guidelines. There's been a direct report from corporate." Her eyes widened. "What? You're removing me? For that girl?" She spat the word girl like it was poison. "She doesn't even look like she belongs in first class." Passengers stared, stunned. Some pulled out their phones, already recording. "That girl," the supervisor said calmly, "is the daughter of our CEO." The woman froze, her face draining of color. I didn't know," she stammered. "Exactly," the supervisor said. "And you didn't care?" She was escorted off the plane in front of a silent, watching cabin. No one applauded. It wasn't a movie. It was real, and it was powerful. The girl was then approached by the same supervisor. "Miss, we sincerely apologize for what happened. Please come back to your original seat." He walked with her back to first class, this time with respect. Other passengers stood to let her pass, some murmuring apologies. One woman even said, "You handled that with such grace." A new flight attendant, visibly kinder, greeted her with a warm smile. "Can I offer you anything, miss? Something to drink? A snack? A blanket?" The girl nodded politely and sat down once more in seat 1A. She put her book away for a moment and simply looked out the window. Not out of sadness, but out of quiet reflection. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She never did. She had always belonged here, with or without the ticket. But now the world had seen it. As the plane finally took off, the captain himself made an unusual announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Today, we were reminded that respect, dignity, and equality are not optional on our flights. They are expected. Thank you for your patience." A small smile crept across her lips, not because someone got fired, not because revenge was served, but because dignity had been restored. She wasn't just vindicated, she was seen. It wasn't about flexing power. It wasn't about her father being a CEO. It was about the fact that no one should be treated the way she was treated, that her worth wasn't tied to her skin color, her age, or her seat number, and that next time, maybe someone watching, another passenger, a child, an employee, might remember this moment and choose to act differently. Because justice, real justice, doesn't come with shouting or violence. It comes with truth, with calm strength, and with the courage to simply make the call. She picked up her book once more, now feeling just a little lighter, and flipped to the page where she left off. The flight continued, but something much bigger had taken off that day. A new standard, a shift, a reminder that sometimes the quietest ones have the loudest impact. And no matter how high the sky, dignity always flies first class. The soft hum of the airport filled the air as Kennedy stepped onto the plane, clutching her travel tote and favorite novel. Her first-class boarding pass nestled safely in her coat pocket. She was used to traveling alone, confident, composed, polite. But this flight felt special. It was her reward after a year of hard work and graduation with honors. She quietly walked to seat 2A, nodding at a few passengers, most of whom didn't even look up. She tucked her curly hair behind her. Ears placed her bag under the seat and pulled out her book, preparing for the long-haul journey. She didn't notice the stares at first. She was used to people sizing her up. Being young, black, and dressed in simple travel clothes often made people underestimate her. But she never let it bother her. That was until a flight attendant, a stern-looking woman in her early 40s with a clipped blonde bun and forced smile, walked over. "Excuse me," the woman said, with a voice that sounded more like an order than a question. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Kennedy looked up calmly. "No, this is 2A, she replied, reaching for her boarding pass. "I'm pretty sure I'm right." The woman barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "First class is reserved for premier members and elite status passengers. You must be in economy. I need you to move. Now." Her voice wasn't just firm. It was laced with an unspoken judgment. Other passengers began to look up. Some glanced at Kennedy, others awkwardly stared away. "I'm sorry, but I paid for this seat. I have every right to be here," Kennedy replied, her voice still measured, though she could feel her heart pounding. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. "Do you really want to make a scene?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Kennedy sat still, shocked, trying to decide if she should stand her ground or just comply to avoid conflict. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said at last. "I'm not going to move unless someone explains what rule I've broken." The flight attendant scoffed. "You want a supervisor? Fine." She turned sharply and walked away, mumbling something under her breath. Kennedy could feel all eyes on her now, some curious, others silently judging. She felt her dignity slipping, not because she did anything wrong, but because she was being treated as though she didn't belong. And in that moment, something inside her stirred. Not rage, not fear, but clarity. She picked up her phone, scrolled to one number, and pressed call. "Hi, Daddy," she said, her voice quiet. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end. "What happened?" the voice asked. Calm, powerful, direct. "They're trying to move me from first class. The flight attendant says I don't belong here." There was silence for a beat. Then, "Stay seated, I'll handle it." Most people on that plane didn't know who Kennedy was. But the man on the other end of the phone? He wasn't just her father. He was the CEO of the entire airline, the one whose name was on every company policy, training manual, and annual shareholder letter. While the flight attendants continued prep and a few passengers whispered, Kennedy sat still, staring out the window, heart beating but hands calm. 10 minutes later, just before takeoff, the plane's intercom dinged. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay due to a staffing issue. Please remain seated." Murmurs rose again, then footsteps. A man in a suit, clearly not a part of the flight crew, walked briskly down the jet bridge and onto the plane. He carried an ID badge and his face was tight with purpose. He walked straight to the flight attendant who had confronted Kennedy. "Ma'am," he said quietly but firmly, "I need to speak with you immediately. Step outside the aircraft." "Why?" she asked, clearly annoyed. "What's going on?" "This is a disciplinary matter," he said, showing his badge. "And credentials. There's been a direct call from corporate." The flight attendant's face fell. "From corporate?" she echoed, suddenly confused. The man nodded. "Yes, from the CEO's office. The young woman you attempted to remove from first class is his daughter." Gasps echoed throughout the cabin. The tension snapped into silence. The passengers who had silently judged Kennedy now looked embarrassed. Some whispered apologies under their breath. The flight attendant's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to say, "I didn't know." She didn't say, "She shouldn't have to say," the man interrupted, his voice growing firmer. "You made assumptions based on her age, based on her appearance, and frankly, based on her race. You violated our company's anti-discrimination policy and first-class passenger protocols." "Please," she said now, panic creeping into her voice. "It was a misunderstanding." "No, ma'am," the man replied. "It was misconduct." He turned to the captain and gave a short nod. Moments later, the flight attendant was escorted off the aircraft. Her exit was silent except for the buzz of a dozen phones recording the moment. No one spoke. No one stopped it. Because deep down, everyone knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about how people are seen and treated and valued. The man then approached Kennedy, who had remained composed through it all. "Miss Kennedy," he said gently, "I'm so sorry this happened. Your father sends his deepest apologies, and he wants you to know this won't be tolerated, ever." She nodded. "Thank you," she said simply, not needing to say more. The rest of the crew, now alert and more respectful, offered her a warm smile, beverages, and sincere courtesy. But she didn't need the extras. She just needed her dignity. The captain himself made a rare announcement before takeoff. "We want to sincerely apologize to one of our passengers today. Discrimination has no place on our planes. Respect is not optional, it's required. Thank you for your patience, and we hope this flight restores your faith in how people should be treated." As the plane soared into the sky, Kennedy returned to her book, but her mind lingered on everything that had just happened. Not because she felt victorious, but because she understood the weight of it. She knew that somewhere on the plane was a little girl watching, a girl who saw someone who looked like her standing firm, being treated unfairly, and then standing tall again. And that mattered, because this wasn't just about one flight. It was about every time someone like her had been told, subtly or directly, that they didn't belong. And how one moment, one phone call, could flip the narrative. She didn't get revenge, she got respect, and that was far more powerful. When the plane landed hours later, several passengers stopped to say sorry or, "You handled that with class." One even asked for a photo. Not because Kennedy was famous, but because she'd reminded people what quiet strength looked like. And as she stepped off the plane and into the arrivals hall, her father was waiting, arms open, eyes proud. "You did good, kid," he said, hugging her tightly. She smiled. "So did you." And together, they walked away, not just as family, but as a statement that no matter where you sit on the plane or in life, everyone deserves to be treated like they belong. Kennedy boarded the plane with quiet excitement, holding her favorite hoodie, headphones, and a hardcover book she'd been saving for this exact trip. She was just 18, fresh out of high school, and had been gifted this first-class ticket by her father to celebrate her acceptance into Yale. It was her first time flying alone in first class, and though she didn't dress extravagantly, just jeans, sneakers, and a curly ponytail, her smile showed she belonged right where she was. As she settled into her seat, 2A, she politely greeted the businessman beside her and prepared to relax. But just minutes later, a stern voice interrupted her peace. "Excuse me, miss," said a middle-aged flight attendant with tight lips and an even tighter bun. "This section is for first-class passengers only." Kennedy looked up, confused. "Yes, this is my seat. 2A. The woman frowned. "Let me see your ticket." Kennedy handed it over calmly, heart thumping just a little, unsure why she was being questioned. The woman glanced at it, then back at Kennedy. "I think you must be confused. There's no way this is right. You probably switched with someone or came to the wrong section. I'll have to ask you to move." Kennedy blinked, stunned, trying to maintain her composure. "I didn't switch anything. I was assigned this seat. You scanned my boarding pass already." The attendant sighed impatiently. "Let's not make a scene, okay? We'll find you a more appropriate seat in the back." At that moment, everything around Kennedy seemed to blur, the murmurs of nearby passengers, the awkward glances, the pit in her stomach. She felt the sting of not being seen, of not being believed, and of being reduced to a stereotype. Her skin, her youth, her simple clothes had painted a false picture in this woman's mind. But Kennedy wasn't one to shrink back. She calmly reached for her phone and dialed a number she'd only used in emergencies. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "I'm on the plane. They're trying to move me from my seat. Can you help?" The voice on the other end, calm but immediately alert, replied, "Stay put, don't argue, I'll take care of it." What the flight attendant and most of the cabin didn't know was that Kennedy's father was not just some well-off dad. He was the CEO of the airline, not a regional manager, not a district supervisor. He ran the entire company. Every employee handbook, customer policy, and service standard came directly from his leadership. And the moment he hung up that call, wheels began turning. The cabin crew continued preparing for takeoff, but something felt off. Minutes passed. Then the intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay. Please remain in your seats." Confusion spread. Then the aircraft door opened again, and a sharply dressed man in a navy blazer entered briskly. His badge read, "Regional Director, Corporate Affairs." He spoke briefly to the captain, then walked straight to the problematic flight attendant. The conversation was quiet, but firm. "You need to step off the aircraft," he said flatly. She blinked. "What?" "You're being removed from this flight pending a discrimination review." She glanced toward Kennedy, then back at the director, her face turning red. "You're removing me? For her?" she hissed. He didn't respond. Passengers around them stopped pretending to ignore what was happening. The tension was electric. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted. "She was rude. Enough," the man said. "We've reviewed the call. We know exactly what happened." As she was escorted off the plane, passengers watched in complete silence until a soft clap started from the back of first class. Then another and another. Soon, several passengers were clapping, some even standing, not out of cruelty, but in recognition of justice being served. Kennedy, who had remained quiet throughout, was gently approached by another crew member. "Miss Kennedy," she said kindly, "we sincerely apologize for everything that just happened. May I guide you back to your seat?" Kennedy nodded, her throat tight, heart pounding. But this time, as she returned to seat 2A, no one questioned her, stared her down, or asked her to move. The businessman beside her now leaned over and said, "You handled that with real grace. Your father must be proud." She smiled faintly, still absorbing the moment. As the flight finally took off, the captain made a rare announcement. "We apologize for the earlier delay. At our airline, we stand firmly against any form of discrimination. Every passenger, regardless of age, race, or appearance, deserves respect and dignity. Thank you for your understanding." The words hung in the air like a promise. Kennedy sat back, finally opening her book, though her mind was elsewhere. She knew this flight would be remembered, not just by her, but by everyone on board, because in that hour something shifted. The flight attendant had assumed power based on bias, appearance, and assumption. But true power had come from dignity, self-control, and one quiet call. And karma had done its job. What was meant to humiliate Kennedy had only lifted her higher. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just lived the moment with the quiet strength that had always defined her. And when she landed, her father was there, arms open, pride in his eyes, not because his title had fixed something, but because his daughter had shown the world who she was without raising her voice once. In a world where too many people get silenced, dismissed, or disrespected based on nothing but their appearance, Kennedy had reminded everyone watching that respect is not earned through titles or uniforms. It's a right to be treated fairly, a right to belong. And for every girl who'd ever been told she didn't look the part, that day Kennedy looked exactly like a leader in her own story. Kennedy stepped onto the plane with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a peaceful smile on her face, excited about the long-awaited vacation she was taking after finishing her finals. She had worked hard all year, and this trip, gifted by her dad, was meant to be a breath of fresh air before college started. Clutching her first-class boarding pass, she found her seat, 2A by the window, plush leather, and plenty of legroom. She felt grateful, not entitled. She wasn't wearing flashy clothes, just a clean hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, her natural curls pulled back in a ponytail. As she settled in, she could already feel eyes on her, not the kind that welcomed, but the kind that questioned. A flight attendant, a white woman in her late 40s with a tight smile and even tighter posture, walked past twice, glancing at Kennedy each time like she was some sort of mistake. Finally, the attendant returned and stood over her. "Miss, I think you're in the wrong seat," she said flatly. Kennedy blinked. "No, this is my seat, 2A. The woman frowned as if Kennedy's confidence was offensive. "Let me see your boarding pass." Calmly, Kennedy handed it over. The woman looked at it for all of 2 seconds and then scoffed. "There must be some kind of error. I'll ask you to move to economy, please." Kennedy looked around. Passengers were already peeking over newspapers and phones. Heat rose in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the familiar sting of being wrongly judged. "There's no mistake. My dad bought this ticket," she said, voice firm but respectful. The attendant narrowed her eyes. "Young lady, don't make this difficult. I don't want to involve security." Kennedy took a deep breath. She'd experienced racism before, subtle and not so subtle, but never like this, in a seat she had earned, being treated like an intruder. So, with calm fingers, she pulled out her phone and called her father. "Dad, I'm on the plane, but they're trying to move me out of my seat," she said. "I showed my boarding pass, but they won't believe I'm supposed to be here." Her father's voice on the other end remained calm but carried authority. "Stay right there. Don't move. I'll handle it." The call ended. What the attendant didn't know, and what Kennedy hadn't said, was that her father was the CEO of the entire airline, the man who oversaw the training manuals, the company values, and the very hiring of people like the woman now trying to displace his daughter. Within minutes, the aircraft door reopened just before takeoff, and a sharply dressed man boarded. His badge read, "Director of In-Flight Operations." Whispers rippled through the cabin. He didn't address the passengers, but walked directly to the flight attendant. "Please step off the plane," he said, low but firm. "You're being relieved from this flight and placed under internal review for discriminatory conduct." Her face turned a deep shade of red. "Wait, what? You can't just—" "We've already spoken to the captain. A report has been made. Please gather your things." "This is ridiculous." She pointed at Kennedy, acted suspicious. She didn't look like she belonged here. The director didn't flinch. "That's the problem." And just like that, she was escorted off the aircraft while the entire first-class cabin watched in complete, loaded silence. Kennedy didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply remained seated, back straight, head high. One passenger near her, a middle-aged man in a business suit, leaned over and whispered, "I'm sorry. That was completely out of line." A few more murmurs followed. "You handled that well." "Shouldn't have happened." The new lead attendant arrived moments later, This one, a younger black woman who knelt slightly at Kennedy's side. "Miss, is there anything I can get you? A drink? A blanket? Anything at all?" Kennedy smiled softly. "No, thank you. I'm okay." The sincerity in the attendant's eyes said more than any words. As the plane finally prepared for takeoff, even the pilot came out of the cockpit and stood at the front. He cleared his throat, turned to face the passengers, and said with conviction, "On behalf of our airline, I want to apologize for the incident that occurred prior to departure. Our values include dignity, fairness, and respect for every individual, and I regret that one of our own did not reflect those values today." The plane was silent, but the message was heard loudly. Kennedy nodded, quietly powerful, not because she had shouted or made a scene, but because she had stood her ground with dignity. As the hours passed mid-air, people who had seen what happened continued to approach her. Some apologized, some just offered a kind smile, and one woman from the back, a mother of two, leaned in and said, "My daughter's going to grow up in a better world because girls like you don't back down." Kennedy thanked her. She hadn't asked for a spotlight. She just wanted to read her book and enjoy a peaceful flight. But now, she was representing something bigger. The quiet strength of every girl who's ever been told, "You don't belong," and still chose to show up anyway. As the plane landed and passengers began to gather their things, Kennedy stepped off calmly, where her father was waiting just past security. He didn't look furious, just resolved. He opened his arms, and Kennedy hugged him tight. "You handled yourself like a leader," he whispered. "I'm proud of you." She smiled against his shoulder. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like someone who had stood tall in the face of ignorance and reminded everyone that no one gets to define your worth based on how you look. Later, that week, the airline released a public statement about the incident, reaffirming their zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and announcing mandatory retraining programs for all flight crews. But even more powerful were the countless emails and messages Kennedy received from people on that flight, passengers of every background, thanking her for not backing down, for not letting the moment slide, and for standing her ground with grace. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about belonging, about identity, about the subtle and loud ways people try to reduce others, and about how strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly. In seat 2A, opens a book and refuses to move. Kennedy boarded the plane with a calm smile and a quiet confidence, excited for the trip she had been looking forward to all semester. She had just finished her finals and was heading to a much-needed vacation, her father's gift to celebrate her hard work and perseverance. Dressed in a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, with her natural curls tied back and a worn novel in her hand, she looked like any other young traveler. Her boarding pass read, "Seat 2A, First Class," and she found her spot by the window, placed her bag underneath, and settled in. It was peaceful until the cold stare of a middle-aged flight attendant pierced through her moment. The woman approached with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, miss," she said, voice sharp behind polite words. "You must be in the wrong seat. This is first class." Kennedy blinked, not expecting confrontation so early. "I know. This is my seat, 2A. The attendant looked her over, as if searching for something wrong, something out of place. "May I see your boarding pass?" Kennedy handed it to her without hesitation. The woman barely glanced at it before saying, "This must be an error. You'll need to move to economy." Around them, heads began to turn. Kennedy could feel the weight of judgment from the passengers, the silent questioning, the assumptions. "There's no mistake," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "My ticket is correct. My father booked this seat for me." The woman's lips tightened. "I'm going to have to ask you to move or I'll involve security." Kennedy's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the ache of being unfairly challenged once again, simply for being who she was. Still composed, she picked up her phone and called her father. "Dad, the flight attendant won't let me stay in my seat," she said, steady but quiet. "Even after I showed her the pass." There was silence on the other end, then a calm reply, "Stay seated. I'll take care of it." What the attendant didn't know was that Kennedy's father was the CEO of the airline, the man who signed the very policies she was now violating. 15 minutes later, just before takeoff, a senior airline official boarded the plane, identified himself to the crew, and asked the flight attendant to step aside. Confused and flustered, she followed. Passengers began whispering. Moments later, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. A crew change is in progress due to a personnel matter." Gasps rose as the flight attendant was escorted off the plane, her face red with embarrassment, her voice a hushed protest. She had assumed Kennedy didn't belong because of her skin, her age, her clothing, and now she faced the consequences of her assumptions. In her place, a new attendant, this time a warm and respectful woman of color, stepped in. She came over to Kennedy with genuine care. "Miss Kennedy, is there anything I can get you? A blanket? Some water?" Kennedy smiled, shook her head, and said, "Thank you. I'm all right." The flight resumed, but the atmosphere in first class had shifted. No longer was Kennedy seen as an anomaly. She was seen as what she was, a paying passenger with every right to her seat. One by one, other passengers offered their support, quiet words, respectful nods, a few kind smiles. One older woman leaned over and said, "You handled that better than most adults I know." Another whispered, "My daughter's your age. I hope she grows up with your strength." As they cruised at 35,000 feet, the pilot himself exited the cockpit and walked down the aisle to Kennedy's row. "On behalf of the airline," he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I sincerely apologize for what happened today. It was wrong, and it does not reflect our values. Thank you for handling it with grace." Kennedy nodded, emotion tight in her chest, but she didn't cry. She had already cried for things like this before, in classrooms, in stores, in places, where people made her feel like she didn't belong, but not today. Today, she sat tall. When the plane landed, she was among the last to leave. Her father was waiting near baggage claim, his posture tall, his suit sharp, but his eyes soft as he pulled her into a hug. "You didn't just stand. You're ground," he said. "You reminded people what dignity looks like." The story went viral within days, shared not just because of the discrimination Kennedy faced, but because of how she handled it. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She stood in quiet defiance of a world that still too often judges worth by appearance. The airline issued a public apology and implemented new mandatory training across all departments. But what stayed, with people more than the headlines, was the image of that young black girl who refused to move, who didn't need to prove her worth to anyone but still did, just by staying in her seat. And for every child who watched, every parent who shared the story, it was more than an incident. It was a lesson. That dignity cannot be taken away by someone else's ignorance. That respect isn't something to be granted. It's something to be expected. That strength doesn't always show up as noise. Because sometimes, the strongest people are the quietest ones in the room. Sometimes, the loudest message is spoken without a word. Sometimes the most powerful protest is peace. And in that moment, Kennedy became more than a passenger on a plane. She became a symbol for every person who has ever been told they don't belong, for every girl who has ever felt out of place, for every child who has ever had to prove they were enough. She proved it not with force, but with grace, not with anger, but with truth, because this wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity, about respect, and knowing your worth, even when others try to take it away. Because sometimes, The quietest ones hold the most power.